Dell of the Designers Lighting Forum. I'm one of the co-founders of LEDucation, and I'm very pleased to see everybody here to have an opportunity to listen to this very, very well-refined and not only knowledgeable gentleman. If you need LEDucation credits, AIA, you must go online to do that to leducation.org, or you can sign up at the front desk. Before we start reading this very, very lengthy bio here, I'd just like to say something. Last night I had the privilege of sitting with this gentleman and talking about his projects and what he's been doing. I have a small x-ray room that I have to put some new fixtures in. And I've been in this business for over 30 years, and I learned something last night that I was not aware of. There's something called antimicrobial finish. How many people out here are familiar with that? So I'm the one who's ignorant.
We all learn something every day.
Right. And Clifford explained to me that he has a product that actually has the opportunity not to use antimicrobial paint, but that will actually work in the 400 nanometer?
405 nanometer, yeah.
405 nanometer range to kill bacteria, so you don't need this antimicrobial finish. So I'm sure that you'll talk about that as well. Dr. Janicki received his BS in engineering and physics from the Illinois Institute of Technology and his PhD in physics from Northwestern. He brings over 20 years of photonics and healthcare experience in analytical instruments, medical devices, and lighting in Kenall. Dr. Janicki was the Director of Medical Product Management at Excelitas Technologies, where he commercialized photonics technologies related to infection control, wound care, light therapy, and surgical theater lighting. I'm interested in this too. As Kenall's Director of Clinical Affairs, Dr. Janicki is responsible for translating the potential benefits of LED lighting into the healthcare environment with innovative new products in the areas of infection prevention, improved visual acuity, and circadian entrainment. I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to sit with Marianne just a few minutes ago discussing that. He is Kenall's healthcare expert leading expansion within this field, where he collaborates with key industry professionals on a wide range of topics. So rather than my continuing to talk, please.
Thank you. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your day to give me a chance to tell you about something that actually represents about 5 years of my life or more. And just a couple kind of housekeeping points here. One, I like to put a lot of information on the slides because I know that you're going to likely use them as a reference after we're done. So believe me, I don't go through slides in mind-numbing detail. We're up against lunch, and I'm hungry too. So I'm going to exercise the 3 Bs. Be brief, be good, and be gone. So I'm going to try to do all 3 of those. But of course, we'll have time for questions, and I'm available here afterwards. So let's begin. So, for the lighting crowd, first, let me just ask, how many folks here work on healthcare projects? If I heard the antimicrobial finish, you probably got it. Okay, cool. Well, and so how many of you, the process of that, have worked with someone called an infection preventionist, either on your design teams or through the architect or something, right? So this is something that is becoming a new trend in healthcare. They want to improve the ability of the as-built environment to help reduce infections. And we're going to talk about that maybe in a broader context, and then we'll get down into some cool new whiz-bang stuff that Bob was referring to. And again, we're all equals. If you have a question and you think it's appropriate along the way, please feel free to put your hand up. We'll try to keep it moving along. So this is the AA stuff. I have no knowledge of how this all works. This is like soup and sausage. It just goes in and comes out. The folks at LEDucation will handle all that. And if you need some assistance, certainly ask me. I'll point you to the right person. And so this is a commercial company, but this presentation is entirely non-denominational, and I promise to keep it that way. If I should screw up or something, feel free to tase me along the way. So learning objectives, and my intention is for you to, in fact, learn something and take it home and impress your family and kids with some cool new words and concepts. But really, in a broader sense, what I want to give you an appreciation for is, certainly healthcare in the U.S. and how the subject of healthcare-acquired infections affects all of us and loved ones, right? And then from there, how does the as-built environment tie into that? And then specifically some new types of environmental disinfection, which will obviously help to address that subject. So Without being pejorative, we know that the ACA, again, depending on how things shake out, right, is designed to do two things. It's designed to make all healthcare providers more efficient providers of better quality services. At the end of the day, that's what we have to do to take cost out of the system. So to do that, there's a variety of policy initiatives in place. And rather than lead you through all of these, the key point is that they institute a variety of penalties and fines which affect healthcare providers' bottom lines. And so the way that's done is they simply assess each of these providers against some standards. And this is actually from the Chicago Tribune. This is Chicago major teaching hospitals and other hospitals in the area. And you can see that some score well and some score bad. Kind of looks like my high school math class, right? You have this nice bell curve. And you could imagine those on the left tend to do very poorly, and those do very well, excuse me, and those on the right do very poorly. And that leads to, bottom line, 7-figure fines. Now, of course, these are big institutions, but when they provide poor care, they have 7-figure fines directly against their bottom line. So you could imagine what this does to the CFOs and CEOs and folks who write budgets for these hospitals. That's some number of people, that's additional investment, that's a real number. So the biggest, one of the biggest sources of this fine is the subject of infections. And I mean, how many folks here know someone who has had a healthcare acquired infection, right? Personal story, a friend of mine here at Kennel, his mother went in last summer for a knee replacement and got a blood vessel nicked and got an infection, and she is now in hospice. And this is a real thing that affects real people. So some stats, and again, not to overwhelm you with numbers, but roughly 1 in 20 patients gets an infection every year. They go into the hospital. That's about 1.7 million infections with about 100,000 deaths. And this actually has a financial impact to healthcare institutions now through all the different fines and penalties I told you about. And this represents typically about $23,000 per infection, and you can see that the total cost of the system runs $35 to $40 billion on a conservative estimate. Some estimates range as high as $160 billion if you want to keep the calculator running and get all of the ancillary costs into it. So when you come in and talk to your customers and talk to them about how you can help them reduce infections, you're talking to something that's in their mind and affects their bottom line. You're bringing them something that helps them. So without getting into any gory details here, there's really 4 types of healthcare acquired infections. And they all refer to something called the portal of entry. It's how bacteria get into your body. We all have bacteria in our body right now. All have it on our skin. We're all colonized with it. It's when bacteria get to places that they're not supposed to be that you have a problem. So the first one is a surgical site infection. And of course, we're going to go into that in a lot more detail. Next one is a urinary tract infection. Of course, very painful. Central lines. These are very serious infections because they spread through the entire body very quickly. And here you can see what's called a PICC line or central line. If you get an infection there, the mortality rate associated with that is about 25%, quite high. And then finally, there's ventilator pneumonia. So all these you can see have something going into the patient. That's because our skin, all of our mucous membranes, act as great bacteria traps. God was pretty smart, depending on how you view it, I guess, right? But the point is that when you break that skin barrier, then bacteria can get in there and you get an infection. So just to give you some perspective on this, of those different modalities, surgical site infections, you can see in the lower right here, represent the largest cost by percentage of infection to the healthcare system. So if you go in and talk to your providers and talk to them about how to reduce surgical site infections, again, you're talking to something that speaks right to their bottom line and something that's in their mind. And of course, what we did historically with folks is we would just give them an antibiotic, right? I mean, my daughter went to the doctor a few weeks ago. She had an earache, and they wanted to give her an antibiotic, and I said no, because what happens is when you give people antibiotics for earaches and things that are not infected, you create antimicrobial resistance or antibiotic resistance. And so what happens then is the bacteria in your body, whenever they get a sublethal dose, they learn how to adapt, overcome, and improvise. So they become immune and resistant to the antibiotic when it's delivered a second, third, or fourth time. How many folks here have heard of something called MRSA? M-R-S-A, there you go, right? So think of all these athletes who've gotten this. They have some MMA fighters who got their careers cut short. You know, if you're a New England Patriots fan, Gronk, right? J.J. Watt down in Texas. You know, these are all folks who have had their playing time and careers impacted by something called methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is an antibiotic-resistant staph infection. And so here you have some kind of headlines, a couple key ones here, right? One is from the CDC, the head of the CDC, saying we've reached the end of antibiotics, period. I mean, think about that. That's a pretty profound statement. When somebody like that says, we're not going to just be able to pump people full of antibiotics prophylactically, which means before surgery, right, and hope for the best. What it says is we've got to stop the bugs from getting into people's bodies first. So that speaks to a couple different initiatives. One is environmental hygiene. Another one, which I thought was very interesting, I was down in South Carolina at a turkey plant last week. It was one of the manufacturers there, it falls on, I think, the Kraft Heinz brand. This is where they bring in about 40,000 turkeys a day, and then they deliver a bunch of sliced lunch meat out the other side. Okay, so you don't want to know the details, but what you do want to know is that they're very sensitive to something called antibiotic residue. About 80% of the antibiotic resistance that shows up in humans is due to our food chain. They pump turkeys and chickens and beef and everything full of these antibiotics because they don't want to lose a herd when they're all in close contact and one gets an infection. So when they kill those animals and produce them into food, that antibiotic residue ends up in our bodies, and it affects the bacteria in our body and creates more antibiotic resistance. So the takeaway from all this is to think, how do we prevent bacteria from getting in people's bodies to begin with? So now if you take and think a moment, hold it, we're talking about how do you prevent bacteria from getting in people's bodies. This is a lighting show, right? How do we bring these two together? Aha, there's a method to my madness, right? So the first thing is in the hospital, if you go talk to them about what they're doing to prevent infections, they're going to tell you typically 5 things. And if you walk up to anybody who's an infection preventionist and you say, what's the number one thing you can do to prevent infections, they're going to give you the answer right back like a tennis ball at you, and they're going to say, wash your hands better. So for those of you who aren't familiar, hand washing was first invented by this guy called Ignaz Semmelweis, and yes, I had to learn how to pronounce the name, in the 1850s in Germany, right? So if you think about it, if that was the solution, we'd be done already, right? It's been around for 150 years, just wash your hands, right? Now, guys, your wives are not here, you can raise your hand and say, how many of you actually washed your hands when you left the bathroom this morning, right? Okay, there you go. But not everybody does, not everybody does all the time, or maybe you obey the 5-second rule when food hits the ground. There's lots of alternatives, options to get bacteria and dirty things on your hands, right? So that's number one. Number two is something called antimicrobial stewardship. That's giving people antibiotics when and where they need them. So when you take your child to the doctor and they have an earache, unless it's actually infected, they're just going to give you an antibiotic because they're, quote, doing something. So they get a good CPAC score on the backside when you get the assessment from the hospital. And what that does is it actually creates antibiotic resistance and doesn't help the problem because it's a virus, not a bacteria. Isolation precautions, you've probably designed rooms that are under these isolation precaution guidelines. Somebody might have Ebola, somebody might have C. diff, somebody might have some form of contagious disease, so they separate them off in a room that's pressurized or at least controlled. There's patient and staff education around proper policies and procedures. And then finally, they have these things called targeted bundles. So when you get into surgical site infections, how many of you would think that your blood sugar level and your body temperature would affect the probability that you're going to get an infection? I didn't know about it. But when you get into this, you see that there's actual parameters and guidelines that show how that can actually improve. So there's lots of things going on. But what's missing from all this is the environment. And that's where we bring this all together. So lighting is in the environment. Reducing bacteria in the environment can help reduce infections. So let's think about it. Bacteria can sit in the environment. That's the pathogen. That's the guys in the corner there, right? And they sit there in the environment. And as I'll show you, bacteria can sit in the environment for weeks and months. That increases the likelihood that somebody's going to touch it and pick it up, get it on their hand, and then go touch somebody else. And I'll show you some cool pictures that reinforce this point. So as I said here, some of these bacteria, again, this is the quiz afterwards. You have to be able to pronounce all these Latin names. And yes, there is a website that teaches you how to pronounce these. So, but the key point was the one that most folks probably heard of is, MRSA. I have that in the kind of top there. There's another one called Clostridium difficile, or C. diff. If you're in hospitals, you hear about that. And that thing is an endospore, which means it can survive for months up to a year. It's the equivalent of you or I walking through the desert without a canteen. These things know that they're in a harsh environment. They form what's called a spore shell, a waxy coating around it to preserve its moisture, which makes it resistant to a lot of disinfectants. And very small quantities of these organisms can get in your body and cause an infection. So if you wonder how diseases spread, this is the slow-mo shot, right? No, we're not at lunchtime. I hate when I do these talks as part of a lunch and learn, and you kind of bring some of these slides. You have to kind of apologize in advance, right? And of course, just to put maybe a little bit of a humorous spin on it, we think of healthcare for over the many years, and certainly out inside the U.S., we're very lucky. We have a lot of private rooms, but many places outside the U.S. have shared rooms, and they have these little privacy curtains. And I just have to laugh because I don't know what those curtains are actually doing besides acting as bacteria traps. If you go and sample them, you'll just see there's bacteria all over them. They're just laden. So anyway, so to continue to reinforce this point, this is a study that shows a gloved healthcare worker touching a patient who is colonized with MRSA. What that means is they are known to have MRSA in their bloodstream, and they also have it on their skin and surface. That's colonized. Somebody touches them, they take their hand, they put it on a good old petri dish, like when you're in high school. And they wait, they put it in the easy bake oven for a couple of days, they cook it up, and they see all these bacteria there. And that's the end of the person's hand. That's pretty scary, because that person, even though they have gloves, if they didn't wash their hands, when they go touch the next person, guess where that bacteria is going? Now, just to make the point that, well, okay, this is the only way that bacteria can get transferred, here's the same situation, but now they have a room that's been cleaned. Right, so they had the cleaning people come in, they did everything they're supposed to, and they get done, they come up and they take the healthcare worker with the gloved hand and they go squish, and they touch the table. They bring them over, put them on the agar plate again, and you can see there's still a bunch of bacteria in that room. So that tells you that stuff's being left behind. And if you don't believe that, here's some studies that actually kind of put an exclamation point on it. This is what they call the room roulette in hospitals. This shows the increased chance of acquiring an infection if the previous room occupant had an infection. So here on the left is the chance of getting an infection if the previous room occupant had something called C. diff, and on the right is the chance if the previous room didn't. So it's almost 3 times more likely. So when you go in the hospital, ask them, was the person in the room before me, did they have an infection or not? And make sure you try to get the right room. So what if we treated the building as a patient, right? Everything you've heard about is how we treat the patients. What if we think of the building as a patient? So some kind of analogs here. We talk about hand washing for patients. We want to talk about improved surface disinfection compliance for buildings. When we talk about antimicrobial stewardship, we want to talk about the proper surface disinfectant. And interestingly enough, I've followed some of these environmental services around the hospital. They have a little cart with a bunch of different bottles on them, and they're all labeled. Every one of these chemicals is designed for a different surface to kill a different organism and has a different contact time, which explains why you don't want someone like me trying to do that. I guarantee you it will fail. So this is something that these environmental services folks are trained on and have to be constantly up to date on, because every time somebody in the hospital comes up with a new disinfectant that they want to employ for whatever reason, they have to teach people how to roll it out. And these people have to know all this and do this properly in every room, on multiple surfaces, all day, right? So if you clean the bed rail, you use this. If you clean the bookshelf, you use this. If you clean the bathroom, you use this. Give me a break, right? And I can keep going through the analogies here, but in the interest of time, we'll just pass on. So how can we improve environmental hygiene? Well, the first thing is you throw people at it. That's additional staffing. We know everybody's budgets are limited. And in fact, adding more people is almost a diminishing resource because of what I described earlier, right? Hand washing is an issue. The average compliance rate is about 45% for hand washing in the US. Interestingly enough, the average compliance rate for surface disinfection is about 40 to 45%. What does that tell you? It tells you that it's the common theme, which is people. People are human beings, we all make mistakes, and because of that, that's what we get. So if you look past people and policies and procedures and additional compliance, people are now looking to automated technologies and other forms of technology that can help them reduce infections. So we'll go through that. And lighting is coming into this here if you hang with me for a couple more slides. So there's 3 buckets. There's sterilization, disinfection, and inhibition. Sterilization we kind of have an innate field for. That's the active removal of all forms of life and other biological agents. So you come into the room, you spray this ozone around, and you obviously kill all the bacteria in the room, or you have an endoscope that was in somebody's body and they sterilize it as well. Disinfection is killing some bacteria. Inhibition is what I call a passive reduction of bacteria, and that's really where lighting started, is the inhibition of bacteria through accumulation and or migration of bacteria. So we break those into some examples here, and you can see sterilization is these chemical foggers or UV light. Disinfection, UV light does kind of play the same role there. You're probably familiar with disinfection if you do building construction. You have HEPA air filters. There's episodic technology such as chemical and foggers and so on. Anyway, there's two categories there, continuous and episodic disinfection. And finally, in the last side is the accumulation and migration of bacteria through different surfaces and paints, and in this case, sealed light fixtures. So I think, Bob made a comment about antimicrobial finish, and you guys have heard of that. That's one of the features that's required for something called a sealed enclosure light fixture, and we'll talk about that here now. So how can specification or how can light fixtures help reduce infections? They need some basic characteristics which we collectively refer to as specification grade lighting. So they can reduce the transmission of bacteria through the air, and then they can reduce the accumulation of pathogens upon it through cleanable design and antimicrobial coatings. So as we show here, specification grade lighting has really kind of four key elements. It's sealed and gasketed, it's fitted to the ceiling in a pressurized way, has a cleanable design, and then a fourth element, which is not really related to infection prevention, but is part of specification grade lighting, is EMI, EMC filters to prevent any interference with critical medical equipment. So whenever you look for these types of products, you always want to look for listings, certifications, warranties. You don't want someone to just tell you that their product is designed for that. You want a third-party standard for that. So always ask for these. This is the IP standard, the NSF standard. There's other ones. Whatever, I guess feature you're looking for, make sure you get those testings, listings, and certifications. So the first thing that the light fixture itself can be gasketed and sealed. And what that does is it prevents bacteria going into and out of it. It also prevents particulate matter from getting into and out of it. And in many cases, I've been in hospitals where I've seen bugs in the ceiling in the light fixture. I mean, think about it, that's pretty gross, right? You're sitting in your room and you look up and there's some visitors, That should tell you that stuff's getting into and out of the room. And particularly if it's a pressurized room for someone who's under isolation precautions, or an OR, an operating room, where it's pressurized so stuff doesn't come in the room while you're doing the surgery and the patient's open, having that light fixture gasketed and sealed is important. And of course, last point, is these light fixtures heat up as well. So remember, when you turn the light fixtures on, they're running energy into them, so they heat up. So things start to expand. Stuff can get sucked in, and then when you cool it off, stuff stays there. Next time you heat it up, stuff can flow back out. So again, using a sealed enclosure is an important aspect for reducing infections in the environment with lighting. And you can validate that parameter with both different types of particulate and water testing. These use the IP standard, the ingress protection standard. You might have it on your phone if your phone is IP67 rated or something. This is similar. The light fixture is designed for either particulate matter or dust intrusion. And then, of course, fitting it to the ceiling is another key point, right? You have to be able to pressurize the room so that it holds it, otherwise it just kind of sucks around the edges. That's why a lot of rooms, at least operating rooms, have drywall ceilings, right? But if you don't have that, then it needs to be gasketed and fit in place, or it needs to be seam welded or caulking, right? And so here's just an example of how that would be tested. This would be a cabinet simulating the plenum in a hospital environment, and you'd have the fixture fitted up to it, and it has to be able to maintain pressurization, and that's what's shown here on the left. This case here, you're actually using about 2 inches of water, and there's a standard for this. It's called the K230 standard, and it's based on an NSF standard. So again, you want to look for those things. And then the last thing I'll talk about is fixture cleanability. This is important. When I talk to many infection preventionists, we tell them about light fixtures in the patient rooms. One of the things I always ask is, separate from the ceiling fixtures, but even just ones on the wall, they want to know if they can clean it with bleach or something like that. Because they love bleach. Bleach kills everything. No organism has been able to evade bleach to date. So they will always ask you that question, can we clean it with bleach? And what you want to look for is an NSF standard related to cleanability. That ensures that you can use these caustic chemicals on it, and that the fixture is not designed with all these cracks and crevices in it. So to be sure, you walk through the show next door here, there's lots of really cool looking light fixtures, right? They're very architectural looking, they have lots of neat designs and shapes, but in a hospital they have to be cleaned. And of course that means you can't have all these little cracks and crevices where biogoop can accumulate. And that's what this standard certifies. So again, look for that type of mark when you're thinking about fixtures for that environment. And where would you use these at? Well, it's really a case of where the patient has a susceptible immune system, or where you're trying to restrict the flow of pathogens into or out of the room, or where you're trying to reduce the fixture as a source of environmental pathogens. So a variety of places. Again, we'll leave you to look at this on your own, but of course, things that you would imagine would be the operating room, the oncology or bone marrow transplant units where people have their immune systems compromised. We know waiting areas are filthy dirty, right? Patient rooms, wound care clinics, anyway, you can kind of get the idea. So as we talked about the classifications, we did the accumulation and migration. Now we're going to get into some of the more sexy and fun stuff here. This is more of an active disinfection. So as where before the light fixture was just sitting there, reducing bacteria going into and out of the room and accumulation of bacteria, now we're talking about how can we use the light to actually kill bacteria while it's on. And so we break that down into two buckets. There's continuous disinfection and there's episodic disinfection. Continuous disinfection runs 24/7. You're disinfecting while the technology is running. And you know that today, that's a HEPA air filter. There's episodic disinfection, which only works while you're doing it. So that might be the equivalent of spraying bleach on a surface. It means you're disinfecting at that moment in time. So again, here's the basic categories for that. And how are they different? So let's start. The ideal disinfectant would be one that kills a lot of bacteria all day, every day, right? 24/7. You know, if I could just spray hydrogen peroxide in this room, I'd be killing all the bacteria. That'd be great. We'd all love that, except none of us could be in it because it's so toxic, right? So what you're looking at here on this axis here, the vertical axis, is number of bacteria killed per second, and on the right is number of seconds. So the total shaded area, bacteria per second times number of seconds, is total number of bacteria. So when you look at a disinfectant, it's how much bacteria am I taking out of the room over a normal cycle. So then because the room is so toxic, I can't clean it like that, I make a compromise. I come in every day at 10 a.m. and I clean the room. This is called episodic disinfection. So I disinfect at a very high rate for a very short period of time. So if you look at that shaded area, that's all the bacteria you're taking out. Yeah, you're disinfecting at a very high rate, but only for a short period of time. So what that suggests is an opportunity by which you could have something that operates at a lower level of germicidal activity, but can operate 24/7. So again, if you look at the shaded area, you see the two are very comparable. So it's a different way to think of disinfection. And in fact, what that's doing is it's filling in the gaps, right? So you have these big spikes, but you have these gaps when no one's in the room to disinfect. Now you have the ability to kill bacteria after people have done the disinfection that they normally do. So what does this do to the amount of bacteria in the room? Well, let's say you have a room that's dirty. Just start with it. It's dirty for whatever reason. It's an operating room. They just finished a procedure. You come in and you apply your normal disinfection. That takes all the bacteria out of the room, and when they grade disinfection, they grade it by log kill, which is powers of 10 kill, 90%, 99%, 99.9%. Very, very steep decrease. And then they leave the room, they come back in and do all their business, and bacteria repopulate. And you come back in again the next day, and you see the same thing. And this happens every day, or between cases in an operating room, days in a patient room, however you like to think of it. Now, if I apply continuous disinfection, you'll see that eventually if I just run continuous disinfection, you'll take all the bacteria out of the room. But, of course, we know that people are coming back in, and so what happens is it's equivalent of a cup of water with a hole in the bottom. You're taking bacteria out of the room, that's the hole in the water coming out of the cup. People are coming back in the room, they're pouring water in the top, right? So you get to this point where it's called dynamic equilibrium. So eventually you've got the room down to some level, right? But really you need those blasts of cleaning as well. So if we layer these two together, what happens is you start and apply the continuous disinfection, you then see the bacteria levels decreasing, and then you come in and do your daily cleaning. Now it drops. Okay, no difference yet. But now the next time you come in to clean the room, because the continuous disinfection is running, you come in to clean the room, there's less bacteria there. So the next day you come in to clean, you start at a lower point. The room is cleaner at the start of the next day, is the way to think of it. And you, of course, can keep repeating this cycle, and you can see the benefit, in fact, improves over time. Right? So here you see this kind of asymptotic approach where now you get down to where the room is cleaner every day when somebody comes in. So if you're in an operating room environment, next day you come in to start your procedures, the room is cleaner, it's a cleaner, safer environment for your patients. So if you apply these two technologies together, what's the net benefit? Well, essentially we'll take the previous slide and layer it against 2 slides previous, and you can see the purple shaded area is the net additional benefit. So when you talk to your customers, you want to say, think about additional ways to disinfect the environment. They already are going to do this episodic approach. They're going to do that every day, all day. But with continuous disinfection, you're taking additional bacteria out of the environment. So that's the approach to explain to the customer. And then you can see this kind of graphically shows them. That's a cleaner, safer environment. Now, folks will say, well, does this reduce infections? And the answer is yes. There are now multiple studies that show that a cleaner environment, does reduce infections. Now, directionally, I also just ask folks, well, I may not be able to give you an exact number, but what I can tell you is, would you rather be in the room with 10 bacteria or the room with 100 bacteria, right? I mean, you don't eat off a dirty table, right? When you get your kids, you sit down at the table at McDonald's, it's the first thing you do. You put the food on a tray, right? You put some paper down or something, right? This is that equivalent. So if you're trying to explain this to your customers, what's a simple way to do it? Here's the difference between episodic and continuous disinfection technologies. And if you like to think of it as ultraviolet light and visible light, that would be another way to think about it. So to be sure, as a consumer of the healthcare system, anything that reduces bacteria is good, right? Because you're taking bacteria out of the environment, and certainly in outbreak or terminal applications, where the room is done for the day, a patient has just left, they've discharged, and they want to come in and clean it, you need that ability to get a lot of disinfection in a short period of time. That's where your episodic technologies are very good and very useful. But the issue is it typically takes the room out of service. It's ultraviolet light. We can't be in the room. It's not safe. So there's also safety issues, and of course people have to use these products correctly. So that's a compliance issue. So those are considerations to take into account when thinking about what the solution is. And again, as a lighting designer, you may not be involved in that much, but I can tell you I've seen many more requests for different types of sterilization technologies in operating rooms. You've probably heard of upper air disinfection or something like that. These requests are coming in, and I think it's important for folks to understand the differences between the two. And then so by way of comparison, continuous or visible light is very useful in areas which have to remain operational 24/7. So what I was really interested to learn was that patient rooms are running at 95% or more fill, because that's the only way the hospital can make any money, is to keep its rooms filled all the time. And even the operating room, I was more than amazed to learn that these rooms have 15-minute turnaround times. Sometimes not even that. I would never have thought that. But that's because the operating room is the area where, one of the last areas where the hospital can actually make a lot of money. And so keeping those rooms up and running is very important to them. And what's nice about a continuous technology like visible light is it runs continuously without the need for people to use it properly. That means they can't screw it up, they don't need to be trained on it, and it's there for everyone considering it safe. So when folks, if you talk to your kind of building owners and other folks on the team, they might ask you which is better. The answer is it's neither, right? They both work together, right? And my daughter loves this slide because, Transformer robots and whatever, right? But the key is you want to talk about both of them together, because the two work together to create a better result than either one individually. Hospitals are never going to stop walking around spraying bleach on surfaces and clean it. That's not going to happen. So now we build up to the lighting part of this again. So we talked about how lighting in the environment can passively reduce the accumulation of bacteria. We talked about a continuous and an episodic difference. And now we're going to talk about continuous environmental disinfection using visible light. So we're back to lighting, right? So let's first. So if I told you that there was a light that could kill bacteria, the first thing that everybody asks us, or asks me is it a ultraviolet light? And I say, no, it's not ultraviolet light. It's visible. And so specifically, as Bob asked me in the introduction, it's 405 nanometers. So your lighting folks, you probably are familiar with this spectrum. It's fun when you show this to people who are infection preventionists because this is all news to them. But what they are familiar with is something called UVC. That's over on the left. Don't know if you've seen these things or not. They're little ultraviolet devices. They look like R2-D2. They wheel them in the room. The head pops up and it sprays UV light around the room. Great products for the application. The wavelength that they use is 254 nanometers. So that's what's called UV-C. And then you're probably familiar with UVB and UVA because you put on sunscreen when you go out to not get a sunburn. You'll get a tan, right? And then finally, the visible light is 400 nanometers. And 405 is the wavelength that's used for visible light disinfection, which is interesting because it's far shorter than anything that causes circadian disruption, and it's also far shorter than the typical wavelength that it causes photoretinitis, which is 440 nanometers. So how would you employ this in a product? Well, of course, you have to be able to use the space. So you have to have white light for the space. So that's where, as lighting folks, we have to light an operating room. It's one of the most challenging environments. They need lots of light. They need good quality light. But the advantage of using visible light disinfection is you can stir that into the white light. So now with your overhead lights on, you have some of this 405 nanometer, and it's killing bacteria while people are in the room. So that's the key kind of element of this technology that makes it unique, different, and beneficial. And by integrating it into the light fixture, you save ceiling space, you can automate its use, and you can make it far less expensive to deploy. Now, at the same time, these rooms are typically not in use 24/7. In fact, if you look at operating rooms, they're typically used about 12 hours a day, 6A to 6P. So when everyone goes home for the night, we can take advantage of the fact that it's a light and has automated sensors and controls in the ceiling. That can flip the light from white to blue. So now you increase the amount of disinfection you're getting. No one needs to see in the room, no one's there. To be sure, the room looks like a disco club. I've had many nurses come by and start giving me all the dance moves when they come and see this, right? It's certainly fun to see, but with the controls and the sensors, when someone walks in to get something, it flips back to white, and then flips to blue, and flips to white. And what's nice is no one can screw that up. It's a sensor. You walk in the room, it's white. You walk out, so that nobody's there, flips back to blue. Because we're all trained to turn off all the lights when we leave the room, right? So you wouldn't want to do that with this, because if you turn off the lights, you're not getting any disinfection. So when folks think of this, again, the way to kind of separate it is the indigo-only mode, which has the active ingredient that's providing only disinfection. But it's doing it with more power and efficiency because you're not taking any electrical current and using it to create white light. And then, as lighting designers, of course, we have to have the space lit, and again, operating rooms are very challenging, so you take the blue, in this case, you stir in complementary colors. You can mix in green, yellow, and red, and do good old RGB, or you can use white LEDs, and they mix together. So how does it work? Well, again, without getting into too much detail, you can think of it as the lights in the ceiling is creating this automatic, safe system that creates a hostile environment for bacteria. And without getting into all the microbiology of this, the inside there's a hydrocarbon chain, and the blue light hits this hydrocarbon chain and vibrates it and shakes it apart, and it fragments into something called reactive oxygen. Now, I wouldn't expect you to know what that is, but you do know what bleach is. So if you pour bleach on an organism, it kills it. This kills it in exactly the same way. It kills it via chemical reaction. And that's different than UV light. UV light is like a bullet. You shoot it, and it goes right through the organism, breaks apart its DNA, and makes it have a hard time repairing itself and replicating after that. This is like going over to your car engine, pulling off all the spark plug wires, pouring windshield washer fluid in the oil changer, and all these other things, right, that make the engine just shut down. And these organisms die as a result. And so what this does is it makes it less likely for this organism to get picked up and passed off to someone else. And of course, with any technology like this, one thing that's important to have is lots of data, right? Because without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So there's lots of data on this technology out there, and we'll be happy to direct you to that after this. And of course, to the question of safety, folks, again, because this is a lighting group, this is great to show this slide, because when I show it to medical people, their heads start to kind of turn. But on the left here is a blue line which shows the irradiance as a function of wavelength. And that line is for D6500, so 6500 Kelvin overhead sunlight. And when you take the disinfecting element of continuous environmental disinfection and lay it up there, you'll see that there's actually less watts per square area than overhead sunlight. So that's one way to think of it as being safe. It's a benchmark for what you're already doing today. Another way to think of it, again, because we're lighting folks, we can appreciate these, there's now this IEC standard specifically for visible light safety, specifically for short wavelength. I think it goes from like actually goes through all the visible spectrum down to like, I think it's 200 something, 250 or 260 nanometers, something like that. And it takes into account both skin erythema and retinal damage. And it also takes into account as a function of the source size. So if you think of it, looking at a bare LED chip is, of course, much more damaging to your eye than looking at a large diffused source, right? So one way to think of this, if you ever know anybody who did arc welding, they have those big face shields, right? And they wear those because if they don't, they start to have little blind spots in their field of vision. That's because that very narrow, intense source is focused on your retina, and it oversaturates and potentially damages that area of your retina. That's why you get those little blind spots if you don't wear your face shield. Again, if you don't know a welder, you probably haven't heard this story. And where did this technology start? Well, it's interesting. It started with a young girl as her PhD thesis, so female contribution to science. My sister's a science and engineer, congratulations, right? Started in 2001 as her PhD thesis. And since 2008, she started publishing on it. There's more than 30 refereed publications and proceedings since that time. And this was launched as a commercially available product in 2015. And so if you look at it now, it's in the operating rooms. What it's doing is it's spreading out light through the room, and it's killing bacteria in the air and on hard and soft surfaces. So you'd be amazed at how many products do one or the other, not both. Bacteria are constantly precipitating out of the air onto surfaces and getting swept up from surfaces into the air. So if you're only disinfecting one or the other, you're giving the bacteria a chance to escape, for lack of a better term. And of course, getting to hard to reach places is very important. You know, UV light works by line of sight. So if I had a device here sitting right over to my left, it would be blocked by that table. It doesn't reflect off the walls the same way. Although, credit to the UV device manufacturers, they're trying to get hospitals to come in and paint the walls of their room with special reflective UV paint. It's a great business model. I'm sure the facilities guys love having to have that special type of paint somewhere in the hospital, so they go fix a room when when there's a nick in the wall, right? But visible light, as you can see, scatters around the room. I mean, just look around your feet. There's areas that are indirectly illuminated. And so anywhere you get light, you get disinfection. And that's one of the benefits of visible light relative to UV. So here I'm talking about the operating room. Let's go back and pull some of our earlier knowledge together here. Why are we focused on an operating room? There's 4 key reasons. The first is it's medically relevant. Remember, we talked about surgical site infections. So when you talk to your customers and you say, hey, I have something that can help you reduce surgical site infections, bing, the flag just went off in their head. You got their attention to go to the next paragraph, right? 2, in this environment, the technology can be very effective. There's tons of light in operating rooms. There's 300-foot candles at the center, if you believe the IES standards, right? So that means you can piggyback on a lot of blue light without disrupting the visual acuity in the room. And in addition, the room is only used for about 12 hours a day. So you can flip to that all indigo mode that I was just describing as well. So you can get both modes covered and get increased product effectiveness. And the rooms are highly occupied. As I think I mentioned, these rooms have a 15-minute turnaround time, which means there's very limited alternatives to keep it continuously clean over the day. I was amazed to see how, when you finish one procedure, they have the team of Marines right outside. All of them have their scrubbing bubbles, and they run to a separate corner in the room, and they hit this place, and everybody kind of tags out, and they leave. And they've got a certain amount of time, and they've got to get their stuff done for the next procedure, because one of the docs is looking to get in there and do their procedure so they can bill.
Like a pit crew.
Say again?
It's like a pit crew.
It is. It's a pit crew. That's a great way, right? It's a great way to think of it. It's a pit crew, right? These people do not mess around. So again, as lighting designers, when you talk about operating rooms, if you think of it, here's a typical chart. Don't get caught up on the small numbers you can't see on the right. Just look at the colors for the moment. You'll see the amount of light in each area starts out with lower amounts and gets progressively larger as you get to the center. The yellow boxes are your standard 2x4 light fixtures in the operating room. So most of these ORs are very simple conceptually. They're just boxes. They're typically 20 by 20, 25 by 25, some dimension. And they put a lot of light fixtures to get a lot of light in the center of the room, and that's that lightly colored box in the center, represents somewhere between 200 to 300-foot candles. So if you start with the normal room layout, you might start with good old 6-lamp T8s, right? And that's going to create, if you had, I think in this case here, 10 fixtures in the room, you're going to create about 270-foot candles on the center of the room, and you're going to consume about 1,900 watts of power. Again, certain manufacturers may differ. This is just a baseline for comparison.
Excuse me, is that LED?
That's the 6-lamp T8, sir. And then to go to the 100-watt white LED, that's what your question I think is leading is, now if I would take out the 6-lamp T8 and go to LED, what does it look like? And that's right. And so to kind of give a basis for comparison, what I'm showing you here in the center chart is a 100-watt white LED fixture. So it creates almost the same amount of light within about 20% or so, 10-20% at the center of the table. But as you know, it's LED, so it uses a lot less power, right? You're using about 40 to 50% less power, right? We know that equation, we're lighting folks. But now, if you put invisible light disinfection, this is a 625 square foot room. If you go for a one-for-one replacement, where you take out each of the 100-watt white LED fixtures and put in one of these continuous disinfection technology products, now you light the room the same way, but now you have disinfection in the room. And your power consumption essentially goes back to what it was with the 6-lamp T8. So what's interesting is when the facilities folks think, well, they're when our energy savings, that represents about $250 for an operating room for an entire year. So when they talk about operating room budgets, that's in the noise, right? That energy savings actually falls in the noise. It's really more the fact that now for essentially the power you were probably using before with 6-lamp T8, you now have the ability to disinfect the room, right? And of course, these come in different sizes, and so on. I won't bore you with that. Again, just to think about how you would use it in the clinic, as I talked a little bit about the switching modes, right? You want to have it white light with some indigo when people are in the room, disinfecting plus visual. And then you go to the all indigo mode when nobody's there. So now you get full blast disinfection. And how do you do that? You do that with a couple different types of sensors. Because the last thing you want is someone in the room doing a procedure, and all of a sudden, the lights flip to all blue, right? I mean, it'd be the equivalent of like you're in your office and the lights go off and you start doing this, dancing, right? So the key point here is you start with something called an ultrasonic sensor over the table. And that's because some of these motions can be very fine, right? Their hands are not moving very far. A PIR sensor wouldn't pick it up. So the ultrasonic sensor becomes a great way to help you detect that motion. But then, of course, you have people coming into and out of the room, and you need to cover a large, wide area. Again, these rooms are 600 square foot or more. So that's where you use the passive infrared sensors to kind of fill in the area. And you use those two sensors together, which reduces false alarms. It really ensures that you get what I would call the maximization of dose without impacting visual acuity. And this automates it. So remember, we talked a little bit before about compliance, right? One of the biggest issues in healthcare is the ability to do things repeatedly and consistently. And we're all humans, right? So this takes the human out of the equation. So now as we start to kind of bring things to the end here, we'll just talk about what is the actual proof that this stuff works. So recall we walked through healthcare-acquired infections, the problem with that, the way in which an environment affects that, how we can improve environmental hygiene, different technologies, continuous disinfection. Now when you talk to your customers and say, well, hey, we've got something that can maybe help you out in the operating room, they're always going to ask you, well, what organisms does it work against? How effective is it? Does it prevent infections? That's what we're going to go through here. So this is the eye chart, not for you to remember, and trust me, as I mentioned before, I had to go to a website to learn how to pronounce a lot of these. They're very interesting Latin names. The key thing to take away is there's kind of two buckets of organisms in healthcare. The ones on the left are called escape, E-S-K-A-P-E. And that's because if you look through the clever little list there, it says each organism's first letter, E-S-K-A-P-E, right? Somebody thought that one up and was very clever, right? So anyway, those are the 6 pathogens that are responsible for 90% of healthcare-acquired infections. And when you talk about, MRSA or, Pseudomonas or Acinetobacter or one of those, you're going to hit most of the high points. Now, on the right is some of the more esoteric bacteria, and some of them, in fact, are more important to other industries like food processing or pharmaceutical manufacturing. So again, this is just a way to present things and discuss it. Some of the actual data, this was actually taken by the folks over in Scotland at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. This is an intensive care unit. And so here you can see on the left the amount of bacteria per sampling plate. So they would go around with little sampling plates and get bacteria off of it and count the bacteria. It's a great microbiology experiment, right? But it's just a number for the moment, which is a relative indication of the amount of bacteria in the room. So on the left, you'll see the amount of bacteria at the start before the lights are turned on. Then the lights are turned on for 2 days, and then they're turned off. And here, so you can see with the lights off, there's a lot of bacteria in the room. And that highlights the fact that when you turn the lights on, you see this pronounced dip in the amount of bacteria in the room. In fact, this case here was about a 76% reduction in bacteria. So that means if there was 100 bacteria in the room on the other ends, now there'd be 26, or 24, excuse me, in the room, right? That's a cleaner, safer environment for the patient. Now you might say, well, how does this work throughout the room? The benefit of visible light is that it scatters around the room. It makes it ubiquitous. And the way you figure that out is you look at this data here and you see each of these parallel lines, that's the before and after on various surfaces in the room. The fact that they're parallel tells you you're getting roughly the same amount of disinfection throughout the room. That's another benefit of the technology. It's disinfecting all the surfaces rather than focusing on one. To be sure, there's a couple surfaces where you see a lot of disinfection, but that's averaged into the result. So there's more information on this. There's a website there you can go to. You can talk to me after the show here. Some of the studies in the U.S. here, first one that was done was the Medical College of Wisconsin. This was in their GI diagnostic area. So people coming in for scope procedures. And you're in this area, waiting area, which we all know is filthy dirty. And you're concerned that bacteria is being transported back into the area where the sterile procedures are being performed. So there's a lot of concern about bacteria in that room. And it's roughly the size of a small OR, about 450 square foot. So this data was collected, by sampling in the environment with these little petri dishes I was telling you about, 50 points every day for a month. So you're really getting a map of how the bacteria levels are low on Monday, start to get larger on Wednesday because people are coming in the room, get larger on Friday because more people are in the room, and then nobody comes in over the weekend, drops back down. So you can kind of see the history of bacteria in the room. It's kind of fascinating, right? But the key point that you take away from this is that with the lights on, you saw a greater than 70% reduction in the bacteria in the room. And that really says something. When you can kill 70% of the bacteria by turning on the lights, that's an impact for customers, right? And again, all the studies are out there now that are showing that if you can move the bacteria number and reduce it by about 60% in the room, you're going to reduce HAIs substantially. So not only has this technology been used in kind of an academic approach there, but it's actually commercially deployed in several institutions across the U.S. now. Of course, let's talk about Vegas, right? They just got the new hockey team, they got a football team, right? And of course, Vegas has to be the first to use this technology. So this is a hospital, state-of-the-art facility, did all of its operating rooms, C-section rooms, trauma triage, and the entire emergency department, waiting areas, the exam rooms when you come in, all have the technology. So, because they were very concerned about people coming in from the emergency department, I don't know if you know or not, but 90% of all hospital admissions come through the emergency department. They could almost do away with their admissions department. 90% come through the ED. These people are colonized with God knows what. They come back into a sterile area of the hospital, they're in an exam room, and then they leave. How much stuff do you think is left behind? That's what this is do. This is designed to kill the stuff that's left behind so it doesn't get picked up and carried further into the facility. And not only that, the technology is getting a lot of acceptance academically, more and more studies and posters on this. It's now got the eye of the infectious disease folks. So this was from ID Week in New Orleans last year. And so let me just kind of end here, and let's get time for lunch. Hey, wow. Visible light disinfection provides a way to improve environmental hygiene that complements your current efforts. It's safe, has no UV, and can be operated while people are in the room. It can be integrated with your overhead lighting and operated without the need for people. And one of the benefits of LED is it's reliable. So now you put the technology up in the ceiling and you can forget about it for 10 years. That means people don't have to worry about service contracts, maintenance contracts, all the things that they hate with other types of products. So with that, I would like to thank everyone again for their time. I'd like to thank the folks from LEDucation. It's a great show, great talks. I was here a couple years ago and I couldn't make it last year, but I was very happy to be here. And I'll be happy to take your questions as you have time. Thank you. Hey, we made it 12:30. Got time.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So the LED portion represents about 60% of consumption?
Actually, it can represent 100% if you're in the full indigo mode. And if it's in the mixed mode, it represents about a third. So you're kind of, on average, it might be like, as you mentioned, like 60%, but normally it's about a third. You have about 100 watts of white and about 50 watts of indigo when you're in visible mode, because you want to be able to see good. You don't want to bias the color point. And then you go to the full indigo mode, which is now no one's there, and you want to blast the room. So,
What is the efficacy that's in the multi-mode?
so the efficacy lumens per watt is comparable to like a fluorescent, because it's generating roughly the same amount of foot candles at roughly the same total energy.
And in terms of the efficacy of
The indigo mode?
right.
Yeah.
In terms of combined, not so much the efficacy of the fixture, but the efficacy of the antibacterial.
Oh, right. So the way that you think of this is it's measured a little differently than normal disinfectants. Normal disinfectants are measured in logarithm of kill, powers of 10. So you kill 90%, 99%. That's that short period of time. This is a different metric, but it's killing it essentially 70% all day. So, when you tell people about this, it's a different way to express the number of disinfection. In fact, many of the folks who are disinfecting companies, when we've talked to them about this, have said, we're not sure how to present this number to folks. So the way we say it is, think like this: if your room has 100 bacteria every day, now it's got 30. And whatever you're doing, you're making it 70% better, right? It helps them kind of get a feel for that. So I'm going to hop off here so I can talk to everyone like a peer. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you so much. Hi. Thank you so much. Oh, John, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. That was great. Oh, thank you so much. Also, John, okay, and I'll